The Prime Minister's office has confirmed that Mark Carney will be heading to China for talks next week at the invitation of President Xi Jinping.
More than 70% of Canada's total exports flow into the United States, supporting millions of jobs on both sides of the border. Yet today, that entire economic structure is being quietly re-engineered in a move that could redraw the trade war map of North America and alter the balance of power between the United States, Canada, and China. This is not a routine diplomatic visit. This is not symbolic posturing. Mark Carney's upcoming trip to China signals something far more serious: a strategic response to years of tariffs, economic pressure, and political uncertainty that have left Canada exposed to decisions made in Washington overnight. But here is the part few are discussing openly. This strategy does not only reshape Canada's future, it directly challenges how much influence the United States still holds in a global trade war that is already evolving faster than Washington anticipated. And by the end of this analysis, one overlooked detail will explain why this shift could be far more damaging than anyone has publicly admitted. To understand why Canada is now pivoting toward China, it is necessary to confront the scale of economic risk that the trade war has quietly created. Canada sends more than 3/4 of its total exports into the United States, representing hundreds of billions of dollars in goods each year. That concentration once looked like efficiency. Today, it looks like a single point of failure. Under escalating trade war conditions, tariffs stopped behaving like temporary negotiating tools and became permanent sources of instability. Canadian auto exports faced repeated threats of tariffs large enough to erase profit margins overnight. Agricultural products, including canola, were suddenly blocked from major markets, not because of quality or demand, but because of political retaliation. In a single season, billions of dollars in farm income were placed at risk, leaving producers with inventories they could not redirect fast enough. The damage did not remain theoretical. Investment decisions stalled. Manufacturing plants delayed expansion. Supply chain contracts were rewritten with uncertainty clauses that quietly shifted costs onto workers and consumers. In some regions, a single tariff announcement translated into thousands of jobs placed under review, even before any policy formally took effect. For Canada, absorbing these shocks while maintaining alignment with United States trade policy became increasingly difficult to justify. The electric vehicle sector exposed the imbalance most clearly. Canada imposed a 100% tariff on electric vehicles from China in order to remain aligned with Washington's strategy. The result was immediate and measurable. Prices for electric vehicles rose sharply for Canadian consumers, competition narrowed, and domestic production did not meaningfully expand. Yet despite this compliance, Canadian exports still faced tariffs from the United States. The economic pain was real, while the promised protection never arrived. At that moment, the logic sustaining the existing trade relationship began to collapse. If tariffs could be imposed regardless of cooperation, and if dependence only increased vulnerability, then diversification was no longer optional. It became a matter of economic survival. What happens next is not about ideology or loyalty. It is about leverage. And the next phase of this strategy introduces a pressure point that could fundamentally weaken the tariff-based trade war framework itself. The most consequential detail has not yet entered public debate, and once it does, Washington may realize the cost far exceeds what anyone planned for. The trade war is often discussed in terms of policy and diplomacy, but its most severe consequences are felt far from negotiation tables. They appear in factory towns, farming communities, and household budgets across Canada and the United States. When tariffs are imposed, they do not remain abstract. They translate directly into higher prices, lost income, and long-term economic insecurity. In Canada, the auto sector offers a clear example. Automotive manufacturing supports hundreds of thousands of direct and indirect jobs, many of them tied tightly to cross-border supply chains with the United States. When tariffs threatened these flows, companies did not wait for final decisions. Capital spending slowed immediately, expansion projects were postponed, temporary workers were released first, followed by hiring freezes that quietly reduced employment opportunities across entire regions. Even without full implementation, the mere possibility of tariffs was enough to chill investment. Agriculture faced a different but equally damaging shock. When China imposed tariffs on Canadian canola in response to deteriorating political relations, farmers lost access to one of their most important export markets almost overnight. Canola is not a niche product. It represents billions of dollars in annual exports and underpins rural economies across multiple provinces. Once shipments stopped, storage facilities filled rapidly, prices fell, and farmers were forced to absorb losses they could not pass on. These were not market-driven failures. They were political casualties of a trade war. Canada did not initiate but was forced to endure. Consumers felt the impact as well. Tariffs raise costs throughout the supply chain, and those costs rarely stop at the border. In the electric vehicle market, the 100% tariff imposed on Chinese imports pushed prices upward immediately. For middle-income households already facing higher food and housing costs, the promise of affordable electric transportation faded. Adoption slowed, not because of lack of interest, but because policy choices made vehicles less accessible. The burden landed squarely on consumers, not on foreign producers. What is often overlooked is how closely these effects mirror outcomes inside the United States. When Canadian plants slow production, American suppliers lose orders. When Canadian farmers lose export markets, United States processors and logistics firms see reduced volumes. The trade war does not isolate pain. It redistributes it across borders in ways that are difficult to trace but impossible to avoid. From Washington's perspective, tariffs are designed to project strength. But the structure of the North American economy makes this strategy far riskier than it seems. Canada is not a distant trading partner. It is the largest export market for many American states and a critical supplier of energy, minerals, and manufactured components. Disruptions in Canada do not remain contained. They flow directly back into the United States economy. When Canadian manufacturers face uncertainty, American factories downstream feel it within weeks. Supply chains that were optimized over decades do not adapt quickly. Components arrive late. Costs rise. Delivery schedules slip. For consumers, this shows up as higher prices. For workers, it appears as reduced hours and delayed wage growth. For policymakers, it emerges as unexplained inflationary pressure that tariffs were never supposed to create. This exposure becomes even more dangerous when Canada begins seeking alternatives. If agricultural exports are redirected toward China, American intermediaries lose business. If energy flows shift, regional price stability is affected. If manufacturing partnerships are diversified, United States firms lose preferential access they once took for granted. None of this happens overnight, but once momentum builds, it is difficult to reverse. This is the point at which the trade war stops being a bilateral dispute and becomes a systemic risk. The assumption that Canada will always absorb pressure because it has no other option is the assumption now being dismantled. And the moment Canada proves that alternative markets can replace even a portion of United States demand, the entire leverage model begins to weaken. What comes next is not a headline-grabbing confrontation. It is quieter and more destabilizing. It involves trade routes, pricing structures, and market access being recalculated in ways that Washington does not directly control. One specific development, still largely unspoken in public discussions, may accelerate this shift faster than policymakers expect. And once it becomes visible, the consequences for the United States could be far more severe than the tariffs that triggered this response. From Washington's perspective, tariffs have long been viewed as a demonstration of strength. In a trade war, the assumption is simple. The larger economy can impose costs that smaller partners cannot afford to absorb. But that assumption depends entirely on one condition: dependence without alternatives. What is now unfolding suggests that condition no longer holds. The economic relationship between the United States and Canada is among the largest bilateral trade relationships in the world, exceeding hundreds of billions of dollars in annual flows. Millions of American jobs rely on uninterrupted access to Canadian markets and materials. Entire industrial ecosystems, particularly in automotive manufacturing, aerospace, agriculture, and energy, were built on the premise of frictionless cross-border trade. Tariffs disrupt that premise instantly. When Canada signals that it is actively developing alternative trade corridors with China, the strategic risk for the United States multiplies. Tariffs lose their deterrent effect when the targeted country can redirect even a fraction of its exports elsewhere. In practical terms, this means that pressure applied by Washington produces diminishing returns. Each additional tariff risks accelerating diversification rather than forcing compliance. The electric vehicle issue illustrates this danger clearly. If Canada reopens its market to Chinese electric vehicles, the impact does not stop at lower prices for Canadian consumers. Canada sits directly adjacent to the United States market. Supply chains, logistics networks, and regulatory proximity make Canada an unavoidable factor in North American automotive competition. Even without direct access, the presence of Chinese vehicles in Canada undermines tariff-based containment strategies by weakening pricing power and reshaping consumer expectations across the region. More broadly, when Canada begins trading more deeply with China, American exporters face a new kind of competition. Chinese firms gain indirect access to North American demand signals, while American companies risk losing preferred supplier status in a market they once dominated. Over time, this erodes influence not through confrontation, but through substitution. And substitution is far more difficult to counter than retaliation. What makes this shift especially concerning for Washington is its visibility to other partners. When allies observe that tariffs push even the closest economic partners toward alternatives, the lesson is absorbed quickly. Dependence becomes a liability. Diversification becomes a necessity. Internationally, Canada's strategy is being read not as defiance, but as adaptation. European policymakers have quietly welcomed Ottawa's efforts to rebalance trade exposure, viewing it as a rational response to a more volatile global trade environment. For them, Canada's pivot confirms a broader trend. Traditional alliances no longer guarantee economic predictability. China, meanwhile, sees opportunity. Canadian agriculture, energy, and advanced manufacturing align with China's long-term import needs. The reopening of dialogue after years of frozen relations signals that political barriers are not permanent when economic incentives are strong enough. For Beijing, Canada represents both a reliable supplier and a symbolic case study in how trade war dynamics can be neutralized without direct confrontation. Other middle powers are paying close attention. Countries that once assumed proximity to the United States ensured stability are now reassessing that belief. If Canada, one of America's most integrated partners, concludes that overexposure carries unacceptable risk, then the implications extend far beyond North America. The trade war is no longer just about tariffs. It is about credibility. This is where the shift becomes most dangerous for the United States. Power in global trade does not erode through dramatic breaks. It weakens gradually as alternatives normalize and preferences change. Each new agreement, each redirected shipment, each diversified supply chain reduces reliance on any single market. Once that process crosses a certain threshold, leverage disappears quietly and rarely returns. What remains undisclosed in most public discussions is how close this threshold may already be. One forthcoming decision, tied directly to Canada's engagement with China, could accelerate this realignment faster than markets or policymakers are prepared for. And when that decision becomes visible, it may force a reassessment of the trade war strategy itself. At first glance, Canada's approach may appear cautious, even restrained. There are no dramatic speeches, no public ultimatums, no overt threats aimed at Washington. But that appearance is deceptive. What Mark Carney is executing is not a policy adjustment. It is a structural redesign of how Canada interacts with global markets during a trade war. For decades, Canada's economic model assumed that alignment with the United States ensured protection. Under that model, trade-offs were acceptable because stability was guaranteed. That guarantee no longer exists. Tariffs are imposed without warning. Agreements are treated as provisional. Entire sectors are exposed to political calculations beyond their control. Carney's response is to remove the condition that makes tariffs effective in the first place: dependence. By expanding Canada's trade footprint across Europe and Asia, and now re-engaging China, Canada is deliberately lowering the cost of saying no. When a country has multiple large export markets capable of absorbing agricultural output, energy supply, and manufactured goods, pressure from any single partner loses its force. Tariffs become a cost to be negotiated rather than a weapon to be feared. This strategy also recalibrates risk internally. Businesses invest with greater confidence when they know market access does not hinge on a single foreign capital. Farmers regain leverage when alternative buyers exist. Manufacturers can restructure supply chains without being locked into one political relationship. Over time, this produces resilience that cannot be undone by a single election cycle or policy shift in the United States. The most dangerous aspect of this transition is not its visibility, but its momentum. Trade systems do not change overnight. They change gradually, then suddenly. Once a critical threshold is crossed, the old structure collapses faster than policymakers expect. If Canada succeeds in restoring agricultural exports to China while simultaneously reopening its market to Chinese electric vehicles, the shift becomes self-reinforcing. Farmers regain revenue streams measured in billions of dollars annually. Consumers gain access to lower-priced vehicles. Logistics networks adapt. Financial institutions recalibrate risk models. At that point, reversing course becomes economically irrational. For the United States, this represents a profound strategic dilemma. Tariffs rely on asymmetric pain. But when Canada reduces that pain by diversifying markets, the burden shifts. American exporters face increased competition. American manufacturers lose privileged access. American consumers absorb higher prices as supply chains fragment. What was designed as leverage becomes self-inflicted pressure. The turning point arrives when other partners internalize this lesson. If Canada can neutralize tariff pressure without confrontation, others will follow. The trade war then enters a new phase, one where power is no longer measured by tariff rates, but by flexibility and optionality. In that environment, the United States risks finding itself isolated not by hostility, but by redundancy. This is the detail rarely discussed in public forums. The real danger is not that Canada is moving closer to China. It is that Canada is proving a model for surviving a trade war without submission. Once that model is validated, it spreads. And there is one final development tied to this strategy that has not yet been fully disclosed, one that could accelerate this shift faster than markets or governments anticipate. When it becomes visible, it may mark the moment when the current trade war framework quietly stops working. What is unfolding between the United States, Canada, and China is no longer a tactical dispute over tariffs. It is a structural shift in how power functions inside a global trade war. Canada is not abandoning the United States. It is doing something far more consequential. It is removing its vulnerability. For decades, tariffs worked because dependence was assumed. Canada depended on the United States. China depended on access. Allies depended on stability. That world is fading. As Canada builds alternative trade channels with China while maintaining links to Europe and North America, the leverage that once defined this relationship weakens quietly but decisively. This matters because trade wars are not won by headlines. They are won by who absorbs pain longer and who has more options when pressure escalates. If Canada proves that diversification neutralizes tariffs, the implications extend far beyond one bilateral relationship. The entire logic of tariff-based coercion begins to fracture. For the United States, this is the moment of reckoning. Is the current trade war strategy strengthening American influence or accelerating its dilution by pushing partners to seek irreversible alternatives? That question will not be answered by speeches or policy papers. It will be answered by trade flows, investment decisions, and supply chains that do not return once they move. And there is one final development, still unfolding behind closed doors, that could confirm whether this shift becomes permanent. When it surfaces, it may redefine how the United States engages in trade wars for decades to come. Subscribe for more fact-based global analysis where trade war decisions meet real economic consequences. Thanks for watching.